John Bercow, welcome to the University of Huddersfield.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted to be here.
You're here today to give a public lecture called The Making of a Modern Parliament. It's, in a way, quite a novel day because there was the EU referendum yesterday. The country voted to leave. Were you surprised at that?
A little. It was obvious that it was set to be close. For example, it wasn't at any stage set to compare in any way with the referendum of 1975, when 67% of people voted to stay in the common market and just under 33% wanted to come out. It was always apparent to me that it was going to be a case of nip and tuck, so to speak. But if you ask me honestly, did I think Brexit would prevail? The answer is no. I thought the Remain side would win, not by a monumental margin, but by a bit. But of course, opinion polls are one thing, the real vote is another. And I'm simply giving you a completely straightforward answer. Am I surprised? A bit. It's effectively an instruction to the government, as the Prime Minister has very graciously and properly said today. In other words, it's not just consultative, it must then be followed into practice, and I'm sure that's what will now happen. And the challenge in terms of statecraft is for the government to try to negotiate and facilitate an orderly and efficient departure for Britain from the European Union. That orderly and efficient departure isn't something that can happen overnight, and it does require much attention to detail and a whole variety of issues relating to Britain's interests, Britain's trade, Britain's relationships, the rules to which Britain will be subject, to be properly discussed, negotiated and resolved. But I have every expectation that that will happen. It will take some time. There may be an element of test and even of frustration during the period that that work is ongoing, but I dare say that it will be completed. That's what the public would expect. That's what the public is entitled to insist upon from the people who run our government, and that's what will happen. And Britain will keep going, and the United Kingdom will find its way, and some people will think it's a great thing, other people will think it's not a great thing, but it is perfectly deliverable, and it will be delivered.
Because talking about referendums, I know that you've gone on record saying that it's a good thing to have had this referendum, because the people who voted last time, none of the people are around, well, they're still around perhaps, but the people who can vote this time couldn't vote last time. And you think it's a good thing that, I suppose, every now and again a referendum is needed?
My own view is that it was necessary to have a referendum in this case. Not everybody would even agree about that. There will be people who will say, oh no, the government should simply have pursued the policy of its choice and not consulted the electorate. The reason why I felt it was necessary was that, first of all, nobody who was younger than late 50s could have voted on British membership at all, because the last referendum, the only referendum prior to this one on this matter, took place in 1975. And so huge numbers of people hadn't been consulted. And secondly, this is a big constitutional question. Should we or should we not be a member of the European Union? And it wasn't capable of being resolved by the normal mechanism of a general election, for the simple reason that all of the major parties, or what I would call the traditional major parties, Conservative, Labour, Liberal Democrat, and if you want now, SNP, have an official position, a leadership line, in favour of continued membership. So there was no way, by voting at a general election, that the mass of the electorate could vote for Brexit. And it seemed to me, finally, if you want a sort of third reason why I thought it was a good idea to consult the public. Our membership was unstable because there was a constant argument as to whether it was desirable or not, and indeed whether most people favoured it or not. The anti-EU lobby long felt that they either had or could potentially attract a majority for their point of view. Equally, those in favour of continued membership, I think, genuinely thought that the country, at least the majority of the country, was with them. And the only way to resolve the issue was to put it to the democratic test. So some people will approve of the result, other people will not approve of the result. But if you ask me, is it a good thing that the public have had their say? Yes. Am I in favour of referenda on pensions policy, public expenditure restraint, the use of nuclear power, and a miscellany of other subjects? Answer, no, because I believe in representative government. I believe in the idea that governments make policy, they push legislation through Parliament, they're subject to scrutiny by and questioning from Parliament, and that's the democratic system and model that we have in this country. But every so often there is a big constitutional issue which can't be resolved by a general election, and the significance of which is permanent, and the matter has to be sorted one way or the other. And in those situations, I think a referendum makes sense.
And do you see, given that the Scottish vote was very much a Remain vote, do you see a breakup of the UK?
There is certainly plenty of scope for debate, and there will be some tensions in the period ahead. I think the sensible thing at this stage is to pause and take stock and listen to what people have to say. I'm genuinely not trying to duck your question, because I do think that what you've raised is a big issue and it will be hotly debated, and it may well be that there is pressure on that subject for another referendum or for a shift in policy. I don't myself think it's for the Speaker, who has to try to steer clear of great controversies, and particularly great controversies between political parties or between different parts of the country, to get drawn into that and to start sounding off. So if you're asking me, do I favour breakup or don't I favour breakup? Do I think breakup will happen or don't I? I think that I will sidestep that one and say what you've raised is an issue and it will play out, and a very proper place amongst other places for it to play out is in Parliament, on the floor of the House, in question time sessions and debates, and my job is to try to umpire those in as orderly a way as I can and give people of different views from different parties and different sides of the House and different parts of the country a chance to express themselves. But what you've raised, is absolutely an elephant in the room, and it won't go away.
And you talk about in Parliament, the making of a modern Parliament. You've been somebody that's pioneering change in Parliament ever since your first term as Speaker. What would you like to see done still? Have you got there? Have you arrived?
No, I don't think one ever arrives. I think it would be very arrogant to say that I've got there or done that or that I've arrived. I think we've achieved quite a bit. I think that parliamentary debate is livelier and scrutiny is greater. We have stronger and more frequent and more topical questioning of the government now than we had a few years ago. I grant a lot more urgent, capital U, questions, capital Q, than was previously the case. We have elected chairs of select committees, and that's made select committees much bolder and more assertive, more demanding, more inquisitorial, and that's a good thing. We have a backbench business committee that chooses the business, backbench representatives choosing the business of the House for a day a week, whether the government or the official opposition like it or not, and that's a good thing. It's raised a lot of issues that probably wouldn't have been addressed otherwise, so those are positive developments. Personally, I think there's more that can be done. I think all government business could be scheduled not just by government whips sitting behind a closed door chatting to an opposition whip. I think they could have those matters determined by a House Business Committee with backbenchers on it, perhaps meeting in public, perhaps chaired by one of the deputy speakers. I think that's a useful reform. I think we could change the way we look at private members' legislation so that instead of bills being talked out, filibustered if you like, we could have dedicated slots, perhaps during the week rather than on a Friday, when key bills could have a debate and then be voted on, and if they're not popular enough they would die, and if they've got support they could proceed to their next stage. I think that would be a more mature and grown-up way of dealing with private members' legislation. And I also think, for what it's worth, that alongside what you might call the first order questions of how we deal with debates and legislation, we can improve in other ways. We have made some progress, but I think we've got more to do to make the House of Commons, not just in terms of MPs, but in terms of staff, look a bit more like the country we're trying to represent. I think we could do with employing more women in senior positions. We could do with having more members of the ethnic minorities represented at a higher level. We could benefit from taking advantage of the skills of more capable disabled people who traditionally haven't tried to work in the House. We could benefit from having more young people. And it's interesting you raise the question of young people, because over the generations, quite a lot of young people from relatively affluent backgrounds have had the chance to get a kind of apprenticeship working in the House because they've worked as unpaid interns. But you know, that's not really fair on people who are not well off, who've in fact got no money, who maybe come from a disadvantaged background but are really interested in working in Parliament and would be willing to commit to do so but can't possibly afford to live in London. We have a thing now called the Speaker's Parliamentary Placement Scheme, which gives 10 people a year the chance to work for a member and for the House service who wouldn't otherwise get a chance. They're people from what I would call atypical backgrounds. I'd like to see that scheme extended, and I'd like to attract more sponsorship for it. So those are all examples of things that I think remain still to be done, and that's before you even consider the question of how we restore and refurbish the Palace of Westminster, you know, because it is a World Heritage Site and we've got to keep it in good repair or restore it to good order, but preferably without breaking the bank. So I think that there is still, to be candid, a lot to do, and I am proud of what the House has achieved on many fronts over the last few years. I like to think I've made a small contribution to making things run a bit better, but I think there's a fine line between being proud and being complacent or satisfied, and I don't think one should ever become complacent or satisfied or smug. And I always say, you've probably heard me say it before, if you heard me speak as you said you did at Halifax Minster, that I've tried to do, and I am trying to do what it said on the tin. I said there were certain things I would try to ensure. I would try to improve scrutiny and facilitate more opportunities for backbench MPs and make the place a more modern and diverse institution. I'm trying to do what it said on the tin. Whether I'm any good as Speaker is ultimately not for me to judge. I obviously feel I can do the job, otherwise I wouldn't have stood for it, and presumably my colleagues think I can, otherwise they wouldn't have re-elected me twice. But whether I'm actually a good Speaker is not my call. That's for other people to judge. All I can say is I do my best. I love also getting out beyond the House, coming around the country to places. Coming to Huddersfield is a thrill. Coming to the university for the first time, but coming to Huddersfield not for the first time at all, is a thrill. And there are 3 reasons for that. First of all, my grandma comes from here. She's no longer with us, but she lived pretty well all her life in or very close to Huddersfield, Berry Brow, and then briefly in Newsham. Secondly, it gives me a chance to pay tribute to Barry Shearman, who is a terrific, really active Member of Parliament for Huddersfield. And thirdly, I've got to meet today people from really innovative, cutting-edge manufacturing industries in Huddersfield who are proof positive that Huddersfield isn't just an old industrial town, it's a current and potentially, in many respects, actually thriving place. And to be able to come to the university, which is award-winning and has got 7 different schools of academic discipline and is really thriving, and whose Vice-Chancellor is now Vice-Chancellor of his own university from his own hometown, you know, is a real privilege. So, You know, I have no plans to die tomorrow, but if I were to die tomorrow, I would die happy, feeling I've been very lucky.
The University of Huddersfield, inspiring tomorrow's professionals.